I didn't use military-grade wiping software. I used a microwave. The legal hold order demanded the preservation of all data, but my boss, who died this morning, left different instructions. I watched the laptop spin inside the oven, sparks popping like fireworks. The police would be here in 5 minutes. I hoped that was long enough to cook the evidence. The smell hit me first. Acrid, burning plastic mixed with the ozone tang of frying circuitry. It was a violent scent, utterly out of place in the sterile, climate-controlled silence of the executive kitchenette. I stood with my back to the counter, checking the corridor through the reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator. My phone buzzed against my hip. Another notification from legal. They were broadcasting the legal hold to every device on the network, locking down accounts, freezing servers. They thought they were fast. They didn't know I was already inside the perimeter. I checked my watch. 3 minutes left. Someone was coming. I heard the heavy, purposeful tread of security boots on the carpet tiles outside. They weren't running, but they weren't strolling either. It was the pace of men who had keys to every door. I turned back to the microwave. The laptop inside, a Slake, ultra-thin model that contained 20 years of the company's darkest ledger entries, was groaning. The screen had bubbled. Smoke was beginning to curl around the door seal. I needed it to be unrecognizable. Not just broken, but melted. The footsteps stopped outside the kitchenette door. A handle turned. Locked. I had wedged a chair under the knob. A crude fortification for $1 billion crime. A voice called out from the hallway. It was the head of security. He sounded calm, professional, the voice of a man managing a minor incident. He asked me to open the door. He reminded me that the building was under a legal hold, and that interfering with company property was a felony. I didn't answer. I leaned against the counter, willing the microwave to work faster. The popping sound had turned into a steady, electrical sizzle. He knocked again. I'm harder this time. He warned me that they had a master key override, and that the police were entering the lobby. He suggested that, if I came out now, we could discuss this as a mental health episode caused by grief over my boss's death. It was a clever offer. It gave me an out. It gave them a narrative. I looked at the microwave display. 1 minute. The laptop battery exploded. It wasn't a Hollywood fireball, just a sharp crack, followed by a dense puff of black smoke that filled the small oven cavity. The glass door of the microwave shook but held. The interior light flickered and died, but the turntable kept spinning, grinding the charred remains of the casing against the glass. The security chief shouted an order to breach the door. I killed the power. I yanked the microwave cord from the wall, plunging the kitchenette into silence. The sudden quiet was heavy. The only sound was the hissing of the melted plastic cooling inside the oven. I grabbed a thick oven mitt from the drawer, the one used for birthday cakes and office potlucks. I opened the microwave door. The heat rolled out, toxic and stinging. I reached in and grabbed the remains of the laptop. It was a hot, dripping mist of sleigh and mitzvah. I dropped the smoking lump into the thermal bag I had brought with me, zipping it shut just as the kitchenette door splintered inward. The chair clattered across the floor. 2 security guards burst in, tasers drawn. The chief followed, stepping over the broken wood. He looked at the empty microwave, then at the thermal bay in my hand. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. He told me to put the bag down. He stated clearly that I was violating a federal legal hold and that he was authorized to detain me until the authorities arrived. I looked him in the eye. I raised my hands slowly, keeping the bag tight against my chest. I lied. I told him it was just my lunch. I told him I had burned my lunch and didn't want to set off the smoke detectors. He didn't buy it. He stepped forward, reaching for the bag. I took a breath. This was the gamble. I told him that if he touched me, or my property, without a warrant, he would be the one violating protocol. I reminded him that a legal hold applied to data, not personal effects, and until he could prove what was in the bag, that he was just a rent-a-cop assaulting a grieving employee. It was a bluff, a weak one, but it made him hesitate, just for a second. And in that second, the elevator dinged down the hall. The police had arrived. The elevator doors parted with a soft chime that sounded loud in the tense silence. 2 uniformed officers stepped out, their hands resting habitually on their belts. They looked young, bored, and annoyed at being called to a corporate high-rise on a Tuesday afternoon. The air in the corridor immediately filled with the crackle of their radios, a sharp, static counterpoint to the hum of the server racks nearby. I didn't move. I kept the thermal bag pressed tight against my ribs. The heat from the melted laptop inside was already soaking through the insulation, a localized fever burning against my skin. It was a physical reminder that the reaction inside the bag hadn't stopped just because I pulled the plug. The security chief stepped forward, his earlier hesitation replaced by the borrowed authority of the police presence. He pointed a shaking finger at me. He told the officers that I had barricaded myself in the executive kitchenette and set a fire. He demanded they arrest me for arson and destruction of company property. The older officer sniffed the air. He frowned. He asked if there was an active fire. I stepped in before the chief could escalate. I kept my voice low, the tone of a tired middle manager dealing with an overzealous subordinate. I explained that there was no fire. I admitted I had burned my lunch in the microwave, and that the chief here was reacting to the smoke. I apologized for the waste of their time. The chief sputtered. He insisted it wasn't lunch, claiming he saw me putting hardware into the oven. He demanded they search the bag. This was the pivot point. The legal hold was my only shield, but it was a double-edged one. I turned to the officer. I told him that the company was currently under a federal legal hold following the CEO's death this morning. I explained that this meant all physical and digital assets were frozen, and that the security chief did not have the clearance to conduct warrantless searches of personal effects during a federal lockdown. I lied with the confidence of a man who knew the paperwork better than the statute. The officer looked at the chief, then at me. He saw a hysterical security guard and a calm executive in a suit. He saw paperwork. He saw hours of reporting for a burnt microwave. He told the chief to calm down. He asked if the smoke detectors had tripped the building alarm. The chief admitted they hadn't. The officer nodded, satisfied. He told us to sort out our internal kitchen disputes without the NYPD. He warned me to be more careful with my cooking, and warned the chief about filing false reports. They turned back to the elevator. The chief looked ready to scream, but he was paralyzed by the hierarchy of uniforms. He knew he couldn't physically tackle me in front of the police, without risking his own job. I didn't wait for them to leave. I walked past the chief, shoulder to shoulder. I could smell his sweat and his frustration. He whispered that this wasn't over, that he would pull the camera logs. I didn't reply. I walked straight to the stairwell door, pushed it open, and let it click shut behind me. Only then did I let the mask slip. I leaned against the concrete wall, gasping as I pulled the thermal bag away from my body. My shirt was soaked. The heat was intense. I unzipped the bag. I needed to see a pile of slag. I needed to see gray dust and twisted metal. I looked inside. The smell of ozone and burnt plastic billowed out, stinging my eyes. The casing of the laptop was warped, melted into a dolly-esque curve. The screen was gone. The keyboard was a fused lump. But the chassis, the metal frame holding the hard drive platters, was still intact. I used the oven mitt to prod the wreckage. The drive housing was scorched, but it hadn't reached the melting point of aluminum. It was damaged, certainly, but destroyed. I remembered the forensic recovery specs from the company manual. If the platters weren't physically shattered or demagnetized by extreme heat, data could be recovered. I hadn't cooked the evidence. I had just medium rare seared it. I zipped the bag shut. The legal hold prevented them from deleting files, but now I carried the only physical copy of the truth, and it was still readable. I had to get out of the building, and I had to find a hammer. I didn't find a hammer. I found a fire extinguisher in the service corridor of the 23rd floor. It was heavy, and crude, the perfect analog key for a digital lock. I wasn't trying to open the drive casing gently anymore. The legal hold alert was pinging every workstation in the building, turning the skyscraper into a listening device. I needed a Faraday cage, or the next best thing, the shielded server closet for the legacy backups. I swung the canister. The handle of the server room door sheared off with a violent shriek of tearing metal. I slipped inside and wedged the door shut with the extinguisher. The room hummed with the white noise of cooling fans, a mechanical choir I had conducted for 20 years. The air was frigid, smelling of ozone and dust, the same smell as the microwave, but cold. I moved to the crash cart, a rolling diagnostic station with a dedicated, air-gapped terminal. I unzipped the thermal bag. The laptop was a warped sculpture of plastic and silicon. I didn't try to boot it. That would be suicide. Instead, I used a screwdriver from the cart to pry apart the melted chassis. The plastic snapped like brittle bone. I extracted the hard drive. The casing was scorched, the label illegible, but the connectors looked clean. I plugged it into the forensic bridge on the crash cart. This was my domain. The legal hold froze the network, but it couldn't stop a direct SATA connection on a machine that didn't know the internet existed. The terminal screen flickered. A cursor blinked. I held my breath. The drive spun up. It sounded like a dying grinder, the read heads skipping over damaged sectors. Click. Where? Click. It was the heartbeat of a terminal patient. I ran a raw sector dump. Lines of hexadecimal code cascaded down the screen, mostly corruption, zeros, and Fs, where data used to be. The microwave had done its job on the outer tracks. The file allocation table was gone. The boat sector was slach. But then, a block of text stabilized. It was a fragment from the partition I had encrypted for the boss myself a week ago. He had told me it was his insurance policy, evidence of his own embezzlement that he wanted to bury before the audit. He had lied. I parsed the hex code into ASCII. The fragment wasn't a bank transfer to a Cayman account in his name. It was an email string. The timestamps were from 3 years ago. The sender wasn't my boss. It was the CEO. I read the subject line, Protocol Omega. Asset liquidation. My boss hadn't stolen money. He had stolen the proof that the company was laundering cartel profits through our pension fund. The legal hold wasn't about preserving evidence for the SEC. It was about containment. They weren't hunting me to arrest a rogue employee. They were hunting me to erase the only backup of their death warrant. The terminal beeped. The drive died, seizing up with a final, metallic screech that sounded like a scream cut short. I wasn't holding a crime scene. I was holding a motive. The terminal screen glowed with the only truth left in the building, a spectral green block of text floating in the black void of the command line. But it was just ghosts in the RAM. The hard drive, the physical anchor of that truth, was dead metal, seizing up with a final, metallic death rattle. If I powered down the crash cart, the email vanished into the ether. If I stayed, the security chief would break through the door and bury me in a cell before I could explain what I had found. I needed paper. I needed something physical, something crude and undeniable that a legal hold couldn't digitally shred or remotely wipe. The card reader on the server room door beeped, a sharp, high-pitched electronic denial that cut through the low hum of the cooling fans. It was the chief's master key trying to override the lock I had jammed. The fire extinguisher I had wedged under the handle groaned against the steel frame, the red paint grinding into the floor tiles. They weren't using keys anymore. They were putting shoulders against the door. I could hear the heavy thud of bodies, the grunts of exertion, the muffled orders being barked in the corridor. I turned to the bottom shelf of the crash cart. There, bolted to the frame like a barnacle, was a dot matrix logger. There was a relic I had installed 15 years ago to record boot errors when the graphics drivers failed. A failsafe from an era before cloud backups. It was loud, slow, and archaic. It was perfect. I typed the command line, print LPT1. The machine woke up with a mechanical shudder that vibrated through the metal cart. The print head slammed to the left, aligning with the continuous feed paper with a violent clack. Then it began. A sharp buzz. Chunk. Another buzz. The noise was aggressive in the small room, a rhythmic grinding that seemed to mock the urgency of my situation. I watched the rubber roller catch the perforated edge of the paper. It advanced one line at a time, agonizingly slow, like a clock counting down the seconds of my life. Protocol Omega. A sharp electrical sizzle. The door handle jerked violently downward. The fire extinguisher slipped an inch across the linoleum floor, screeching like a banshee. The gap between the door and the frame widened just enough to let in a slice of the corridor light, a harsh fluorescent bar that cut across my shoes. Asset liquidation. Another sizzle. I stood over the printer, hands hovering, urging it to speed up by sheer force of will. I couldn't pull the paper yet. If I tore the track, the feeder would jam, and I would be left with a useless scrap of gibberish. I had to wait for the timestamp. An evidence chain without a timestamp was just a rumor in a courtroom. The chief's voice came through the gap in the doorframe. He wasn't shouting anymore. He was giving orders to a tactical team, his tone clipped and professional. I heard the distinct clack-clack of a breaching tool being extended, metal sliding against metal, locking into place. I looked at the printer. It was printing the sender field. CEO, office private. I had built a network capable of moving terabytes in a nanosecond, capable of shifting fortunes across continents with a keystroke. Yet my life currently hung on a needle hitting an inked ribbon at the speed of a lethargic woodpecker. The first blow of the battering ram hit the door. Boom. The entire room vibrated. Dust rained down from the suspended ceiling tiles, coating the black plastic of the server racks in a fine gray powder. The impact knocked a screwdriver off the cart. It clattered to the floor, rolling away into the shadows. I didn't flinch. I watched the paper. The footer was coming up. Confidential. Do not distribute. The second blow hit. Boom. The door frame buckled inward. The fire extinguisher was losing its purchase. The metal canister dented and scraping along the floor. I could see the hinges straining, the paint flaking off in chips. The printer finished the line and auto-fed the page with a final, satisfied whir. I grabbed the paper. I didn't rip it. I used the serrated tear bar to get a clean edge, the sound of the paper tearing a sharp counterpoint to the violence at the door. I folded the document instantly, the ink still wet enough to smudge against my thumb, and shoved it deep into my breast pocket, behind the plastic stiffness of my ID badge. I had the audit trail. Now I just needed to survive the audit. The third blow blew the door open. The fire extinguisher clattered across the room, spinning wildly until it hit the far wall. 2 armored guards flooded the gap, leading with riot shields. They moved with practiced efficiency, clearing the corners. The security chief followed, stepping over the debris of the door frame. He saw the melted laptop on the cart. He saw the dead hard drive. He didn't see the paper in my pocket. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who thought he had won because he controlled the exit. I raised my hands, stepping away from the crash cart, showing him my empty palms. I didn't wait for him to speak. I pointed at the dot matrix printer, which was sitting silent now. Its job done. I asked him for a copy of the seizure log for the hardware he was about to confiscate. He blinked, thrown off by the bureaucratic request in the middle of a raid. He motioned for the guards to cuff me. I kept my eyes on him, locking onto his gaze. I told him that, under the legal hold protocols he loved so much, he couldn't touch a single piece of evidence without generating a receipt. I demanded he log the drive, the laptop, and the crash cart serial numbers before he laid a hand on me. It was a stall. I didn't want a receipt. I wanted him to look at the cart, not at me. He stepped forward, annoyed, and glanced down at the equipment. While his eyes were down, I kicked the power strip at the base of the rack. The server closet plunged into absolute darkness, save for the green LEDs of the switches and the red standby light of the printer. I didn't run for the door. I ran for him. I hit the chief with momentum, driving my shoulder into his solar plexus. He folded backward, boots scrabbling uselessly against the linoleum. I didn't wait. I pivoted around his stumbling weight, using him as a shield against the 2 guards now blind in the sudden darkness. A riot baton swung through the space I had just vacated, striking the metal server rack with a deafening clang. The vibration hummed through the floorboards, shivering up my legs. I ran by memory. 6 steps. Turn. 3 steps. I clipped my shoulder against the steel jamb, a dull shot of pain propelling me into the corridor. Behind me, to the server room erupted in chaos, in shouts, curses, and the crunch of heavy bodies colliding in the blackness. The corridor was a canyon of noise. The building's automated response system interpreted the power cut as a catastrophic failure. The fire alarm was a digital shriek, a pulsating frequency designed to rattle the rib cage. A rhythmic siren blare. Whoop, Hope. Whoop. It masked the slap of my leather soles against the tile as I sprinted toward the service core. The strobe lights mounted on the ceiling flashed in sync, turning the hallway into a disjointed series of snapshots. A water cooler, a potted plant, the exit sign. I ignored the elevators. The legal hold would have grounded them to the lobby, creating a neat little kill box for anyone stupid enough to push the call button. I hit the crash bar of the east stairwell. Cold steel bit into my palm. I threw my weight against it. The door gave way with a heavy hydraulic groan. I slipped inside the concrete throat of the stairwell. The air was stagnant, heavy against my skin, smelling faintly of old dust and uncirculated air. The alarm was muffled by the fire-rated door closing behind me, replaced by the hollow echo of the vertical shaft. I paused to calibrate. My breath came in ragged gasps, loud in the confined space. Below, the heavy, rhythmic tread of tactical boots ascending. Fast, precision steps. No talking, no wasted movement. Above, absolute silence. A void waiting to be filled. I started to climb, legs burning, suit jacket pulling tight across my shoulders. Every step was a battle against gravity and exhaustion. The printout in my breast pocket crinkled against my chest, a dry, rasping reminder that I was now carrying contraband. It felt hot against my heart, heavier than a piece of paper had any right to be. I reached the 25th floor landing. My hand swiped the slick railing to pivot, my grip slipping on the condensation. Then I froze. The door handle to the 25th floor turned. The latch clicked, a sharp, metallic sound echoing down the shaft like a gunshot. A team coming up, a team waiting above. Pinched. I looked at the service riser panel next to the standpipe. A narrow access hatch, painted drab gray, invisible to the uninitiated. It was my only option, a desperate gamble against the building's anatomy. I jammed my fingers into the recessed latch. Stiff paint. I pulled until the tendons in my forearm screamed, until I felt a nail tear. The panel popped free with a snap that sounded dangerously loud. I squeezed into the riser. A suffocating fit. Rubber-coated Ethernet cables pressed against my face, smelling of old dust and insulation. The darkness was absolute. I pulled the panel back, holding it by friction just as the stairwell door above slammed open. I hung in the dark web of the building's nervous system, boots finding purchase on a conduit bracket. I pressed my ear against the thin metal panel, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The boots on the landing were heavy, slow, deliberate. Then a voice. Love, distorted by a throat mic. Floor clear. Target is not in the vertical. Resume sweep. I frowned in the darkness. The company's security used Motorola handsets that chirped. They didn't use throat mics. They didn't use target. I shifted my weight slightly. My knee bumped. Something hard, clamped to the cable bundle. I reached out in the dark, my fingers tracing the shape. A repeater box. Textured, military-grade plastic, velcroed hastily to the trunk line. I could feel the heat of a hidden LED pulsing against my fingertips. This wasn't a legal hold enforcement team. This was an extraction squad running on a private comms loop. The legal hold was just the cover story, to empty the building. And I was clinging to the only cable they hadn't cut yet. I hung, suspended in the shaft, my boots wedged against a conduit bracket that dug into my arch through the leather sole. The darkness was a physical weight, pressing against my eyelids. I didn't dare turn on my phone, flashlight. In this absolute black, even the glow of a screen would beacon like a lighthouse to the team sweeping the stairwell below. I had to see with my fingers. I reached out to the repeater box clamped to the cable bundle. My thumb traced the casing. It wasn't smooth consumer plastic. It was textured, rubberized, with a seam running along the side that felt sharp enough to cut skin. I walked my fingers down the length of the device until I found the mounting strap. It wasn't a standard zip tie used by our IT department. It was a heavy-duty Velcro cinch, the kind used for rapid deployment and removal. I needed to see the label. I needed to know who had manufactured this parasite attached to my network. I pressed my face closer to the bundle, shielding the space with my jacket lapel to create a hood. I pulled my phone from my pocket, sliding my thumb over the glass screen to lower the brightness to the absolute minimum. I triggered the screen awake. The sudden, dim light was blinding in the confined space. It washed over the gray insulation of the cables and the matte black of the repeater box. I saw the asset tag. It was a silver foil sticker, peeling slightly at the corner. The text was laser-etched, precise and tiny. Meridian Tactical Solutions, asset number 499. I killed the screen instantly. The afterimage burned silver rectangles into my vision. Meridian. They weren't law enforcement. They were private contractors, high-end fixers for corporate liability. But the box wasn't the problem. The timeline was the problem. I reached back into my breast pocket. The paper printout I had stolen from the server room felt crisp and fragile against my sweating palm. I unfolded it in the dark, the sound of the paper crinkling seeming deafeningly loud, like dry leaves being crushed. I risked the light one more time, shielding it tighter. I shone the dim beam on the footer of the email I had printed. Date, October 14th, 2023. I shifted my focus back to the cable bundle. I wasn't looking at the repeater box anymore. I was looking at the orange fiber optic trunk line it was tapped into. I ran my nail along the orange sheathing until I hit a hard plastic ridge. The installation tag. It was a standard issue company marker, a white plastic flag zip-tied to the cable. I twisted it around to catch the light. Installed, October 12th, 2023. I killed the light. I let the darkness rush back in. The realization hit me harder than the cold steel of the bracket biting into my foot. The repeater wasn't clamped onto the cable hastily today. The dust patterns on the Velcro proved that it had been there for a long time. The extraction squad haven't breached the building an hour ago to enforce a legal hold. They had been inside the walls for 3 years. My boss didn't just stumble onto the embezzlement scheme last week. He had been monitored the moment he started asking questions. The Protocol Omega email wasn't a reaction to his death. His death was the execution of Protocol Omega. This wasn't a crisis. It was a scheduled maintenance cycle. The voice from the throat mic drifted up the shaft again. Clearer this time. Sector 4 clear. Proceeding to executive level. Isolate the target zone. I pressed my forehead against the cold metal of the riser panel. The vibration of their boots on the stairs transmitted through the steel frame, a rhythmic shudder against my skull. They weren't sweeping random floors. They were heading to the executive level, My office. My boss's office. I folded the printout. I creased the edge sharp, running my thumb along the fold until it felt like a knife blade. I slid it back into my pocket, placing it carefully behind my badge. I had the why, the printout. Now I had the how, the repeater. But I was on the wrong floor. If they were heading to the executive level to isolate, it meant they were going to scrub the physical archives. The legal hold was a lie to freeze the digital evidence while they incinerated the paper trails. I couldn't stay in the riser. The pattern was clear. They knew the architecture better than I did because they had been weaponizing it for years. I reached up. My fingers found the latch of the riser panel for the 26th floor. The metal was slick with condensation, cold and unyielding. I didn't try to pry it gently this time. I used the edge of my phone as a lever. Metal casing of the device scraped against the painted steel of the latch, a grit on metal friction that vibrated through my hand. I pushed. The latch gave way, not with a snap, but with a dull, heavy clunk. I pushed the panel open. A slice of light from the 26th floor hallway cut across my eyes, sharp and blinding. I pulled myself out of the shaft, my suit jacket scraping against the raw edge of the drywall. I tumbled onto the carpeted floor of the hallway. It was plush, expensive, and silent. I stood up. I brushed the drywall dust from my sleeves. The texture was gritty under my fingertips. I looked down the hall. The emergency lights were on here, casting long, sharp shadows against the mahogany office doors. At the end of the hall, the double doors to the CEO's suite were locked, but the keypad next to them wasn't red. It was dark. They had cut the power to the locks. They weren't just scrubbing the archives, they were opening the vault. I stood on the plush carpet of the 26th floor, my boots sinking into the deep pile. The silence here wasn't empty. It was pressurized. It pressed against my eardrums, a physical weight that made the blood rushing in my head sound like a roaring river. The emergency lights cast long, skeletal shadows against the mahogany paneling, turning the hallway into the ribcage of a leviathan. I stared at the keypad next to the double doors of the CEO's suite. It was dead, a black plastic brick void of its usual red standby light. The power cut I had triggered in the server room, 20 floors down, and a lifetime ago, had severed the electronic nervous system of the lock. But it hadn't opened the door. It had sealed it. The magnetic clamps defaulted to locked when the current died. My body felt heavy, pulled down by a gravity that seemed stronger here than in the stairwell. My legs trembled, not from fear, but from the sudden cessation of movement. The lactic acid burned in my thighs. Adul, throbbing ache that synced with my heartbeat. I moved closer to the doors. I didn't walk. I waded through the silence. The carpet swallowed the sound of my footsteps completely. I pressed my ear against the cold wood of the door. It was solid mahogany, 2 inches thick, designed to keep corporate secrets in and the noise of the world out. But I could hear them. Inside, there was a rhythmic, mechanical whir. It wasn't the sound of a drill. It was quieter, smoother. A thermal lance. A bypass tool. Then, a heavy thunk. The sound of a tumbler falling into place. They weren't breaching the door I was standing at. They were already inside. They were breaching the wall safe in the private study. I stepped back, my shoulder brushing against the wall. The plaster was cool and smooth against my jacket. I slid down into a crouch, making myself small in the shadows of the doorframe. I wrapped my arms around my knees, trying to still the shaking that started in my hands and radiated up to my shoulders. I listened. "Target acquired," a voice said. It was muffled by the wood, but the timbre was unmistakable. It was the same voice I had heard in the shaft. "Calm." Detached. Physical ledger confirmed. Series A through F. A pause. Then the sound of movement, heavy objects being shifted, the sliding of leather binding against wood. Directive, sanitize, the voice said. I squeezed my eyes shut. I waited for the sound of a shredder, or the crackle of a fire. Instead, I heard a sharp hiss, like a soda can being cracked open, followed by a wet, bubbling sound. Chemical destruction. Acide Ampoules. I knew the protocol. I had written the digital equivalent for the server wipes. But this was physical. They were pouring a binary agent onto the paper records, dissolving the ink, the fiber, and the history of the company into a gray, toxic sludge. The realization hit me in the gut, a hollow, sinking sensation. The legal hold hadn't just been a trap for me. It was a shield for them. It froze the scene so no legitimate law enforcement could enter. While Meridian Tactical moved in to perform surgery, they weren't saving the evidence for the court. They were ensuring that when the court finally unlocked the doors, there would be nothing left but empty shelves and a chemical stain. I had the printout in my pocket, a single dot matrix record of an email header. They were destroying the books that explained where the money went. I heard the wet sizzling stop. The silence rushed back in, thicker than before. The job was done. The history of the cartel laundering operation was gone. Irrevocable. Sanitization complete. The voice said. Zero residue. I rested my forehead against my knees. I had expected a fight. I had expected a robbery. I hadn't expected them to be so boringly efficient. I realized then that I wasn't a hero uncovering a conspiracy. I was a glitch in their maintenance schedule. Pack it up, the voice commanded. Exfil via roof. Leave the legal hold active on the perimeter. I held my breath. My lungs burned for air, but I forced my diaphragm to lock. If they came out these doors now, they would trip over me. But footsteps moved away from the door. Thud. 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 Fading. They were going out through the CEO's private terrace access. I let my breath out in a long, shuddering exhale. They were leaving. They had won. They had erased the past. I reached into my pocket and touched the folded printout. It felt sharp against my thumb. It was just a piece of paper. A copy. But in a world where the originals had just been dissolved, a copy was no longer a duplicate. It was the only truth left. I sat in the executive chair behind my boss's desk. It was oversized leather, designed to make the occupant feel powerful, but right now it just felt cold against my back. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the HVAC system. irrelevant compared to the silence beyond the double doors. I placed the folded printout on the mahogany desk. Next to it, the repeater box I had torn from the riser shaft. Paper and plastic. 2 artifacts from 2 different worlds. I needed a third. I reached for the desk phone. The line was dead. The legal hold had killed the extensions. But the data port on the back was live. A hard-wired VoIP connection bypassing the switchboard, a redundancy my boss insisted on. I pulled the Ethernet cable from the phone. I didn't plug it into a laptop. I plugged it into the repeater box. The LED flared red, then settled into a rhythmic green pulse. It wasn't just a listening device. It was a bridge, looking for a handshake from the external server it had reported to for 3 years. I unlocked my phone. I didn't call the police. They were manning a perimeter, 20 floors down. I opened the internal audit app, the one I built to track compliance violations. I scanned the barcode on the back of the repeater box. The app spun a gray circle. Then it pinged. Asset not found in inventory. I swiped to manual entry. I wasn't auditing. I was registering. Item. External. Comms node. Location. CEO office. Executive level. Serial. 499 MTS. Notes. Found attached to primary trunk. Active signal confirmed. I hit submit. Entry logged. Time 9:42 p.m. Server sync. Pending. Now came the gamble. I took a photo of the printout, the email header with Protocol Omega and the October 14th timestamp. I attached it to the asset record. Then I took a photo of the installation tag on the cable, October 12th. I hit sync. The screen dimmed. The progress bar crawled. The building's Wi-Fi was jammed, but the repeater box, Meridian's own spy tool, was broadcasting on an encrypted cellular frequency. I was piggybacking on their exfiltration tunnel. I watched the bar. 20%. 50%. The door handle rattled. Ampoules test. Then a knuckle rap. Open the door. The throat mic voice said. We know you're in there. The legal hold is lifted. You are trespassing. I didn't answer. 80%. We have authorization to clear the floor. The voice continued. Come out, and we process this as a misunderstanding. Breach, and it becomes a hostile intruder scenario. M, binary choice. Surrender and disappear, or stay and be removed. I looked at the screen. 90%. The doorknob turned harder. I heard the click-click of a lockpick gun. No explosives. They wanted it quiet. I pressed the printout flat against the desk, smoothing the creases. The paper was warm, edges sharp. 99%. Sync complete. Record uploaded to off-site compliance cloud. The screen turned green. I let out a breath. I hadn't just saved a file. I had polluted the database. The compliance cloud was a write-only server in a Nevada bunker, mandated by federal law. Records couldn't be deleted or edited. Etched in digital stone. I had uploaded proof of a 3-year surveillance operation and murder conspiracy directly into the one database the company couldn't scrub. The lock clicked open. The door swung inward. 3 men in unmarked black tactical gear stood there. They moved with terrifying fluidity. The point man raised a suppressed sidearm. I didn't raise my hands. I pointed to the glowing phone screen. "It's in the compliance cloud," I said, my voice steady. "Entry number 8922. Timestamped now. Corroborated by your own hardware." The point man froze. He looked at the blinking repeater box. "Check the stream," I said. He touched his earpiece. A taut silence stretched. Then his posture changed. The weapon lowered an inch. He had the confirmation. They couldn't kill me. If I went missing 5 minutes after uploading a federal record from the CEO's office, the investigation would tear the company apart. I had turned myself from a target into a witness. In the corporate world, you don't shoot witnesses who have testified. You sue them. Loop L6 was open. Point of no return crossed. No, going back to my desk. I had declared war on a billion-dollar entity using their own bureaucracy. "Sit down," the point man said. I sat. The leather chair was cold, but I didn't shiver. I sat in the leather chair, my hands resting flat on the mahogany desk. The cold of the air conditioning seemed to seep directly into my bones, bypassing the fabric of my suit. The room was unnaturally quiet, a vacuum where sound went to die. Across the desk, the point man from Meridian Tactical lowered his weapon, but didn't holster it. He stood perfectly still, a statue carved from matte black Kevlar. His breathing was inaudible. The only sound from him was the faint, rhythmic click of his encrypted comms earpiece receiving data. Then, the elevator chime dinged in the outer hallway, a cheerful, two-tone sound that belonged in a hotel lobby, not a crime scene. Ding-dong. The heavy double doors to the suite pushed open. The security chief walked in. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. He was wearing his blazer, slightly rumpled, sweat stains, dark under the armpits. Behind him were 2 uniformed police officers, real NYPD, not private contractors. Their belts creaked with the weight of standard-issue gear. Radio, cuffs, sidearm. The room shrank. The Meridian point man didn't turn around. He just shifted his weight. A subtle realignment of threat. "This is a restricted zone," the point man said. His voice was flat, devoid of inflection. "Federal, hold active." The security chief stopped. He looked at the Meridian team, then at me sitting behind the CEO's desk, then at the police officers behind him. He was a man caught between 2 avalanches. "I have an NYPD captain in the lobby," the chief said, his voice tight. "He says they got a ping. A federal compliance upload logged from this IP address." One of the NYPD officers stepped forward. He was older, thick around the middle, with tired eyes. He looked at the suppressed weapon in the Meridian operative's hand. He didn't draw his own gun. He just put his hand on the grip, a heavy, deliberate movement. "Put the weapon away." "Ils sont," the officer said. His voice was gravel in exhaustion. "We got a report of an active shooter. You look like the only one holding a gun." The silence that followed was brittle. It stretched, thin and vibrating, like a violin string about to snap. I watched them. The corporate mercenaries versus the civil servants. The legal hold versus the 911 call. I didn't speak. My throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. I wanted to cough, but I swallowed the urge, the muscles in my neck straining. The Meridian Point man tapped his earpiece. He listened for 3 seconds. Then, he safed his weapon with a distinct metallic snick and holstered it in one fluid motion. "Asset secure," he said to the air. "Handing over to local jurisdiction." He turned to the NYPD officer. He didn't offer an ID. He didn't offer an explanation. He just walked past him, his shoulder brushing the officer's uniform with a friction sound like dry leaves. His team followed, silent ghosts exiting the stage. They weren't retreating. They were extracting. The job was blown. The compliance cloud upload meant the secret was out, so their mission parameters had shifted from containment to damage control. The security chief watched them go, his jaw working. He looked at me. There was no triumph in his eyes, only fear. He knew what I had uploaded. He knew he was standing in the blast radius. The NYPD officer walked over to the desk. He looked at the repeater box blinking green. He looked at the dot matrix printout. "You the one who rang the bell?" he asked. I nodded. My head felt heavy, balanced precariously on my shoulders. "You know what you just started?" "Yes," I whispered. He sighed. "Alum," wheezing exhalation that smelled of stale coffee and mints. He reached for his radio. The Velcro of his pouch tore open with a harsh, ripping sound. "Central," he said into his shoulder. "Mike, we have a situation at the target location. Secure the scene. Nobody leaves. Nobody enters. Get the feds on the line." In one, he looked at me. "You're coming with us." "Protective custody?" I stood up. My legs were numb. I walked around the desk, my footsteps muffled by the carpet. "I've seen people lose their jobs over a misplaced decimal point," I said quietly, to no one in particular. Imagine what happens when they lose $1 billion. The security chief flinched. I walked past him. I didn't look back at the office. I didn't look back at the empty shelves where the ledgers used to be. The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside. The officer followed. The doors slid shut with a soft, pneumatic hiss, sealing us in. Loop L6 was closed. The evidence was out. The war had moved from the shadows of the riser shafts to the bright, unforgiving lights of the courtroom. But as the elevator began its descent, I felt a vibration in the floor. Not the smooth hum of the motor. Eschuda. A grinding. The car stopped between floors. The lights flickered. I looked at the officer. He was frowning, tapping his radio. Static. The legal hold might be over, but the company still owned the building. I sat in the small, windowless interview room at the first precinct. The table was bolted to the floor. The chair was plastic, cold and unyielding against my spine. The overhead light buzzed, a high-pitched whine that drilled into the space between my eyes. The door opened. It wasn't the tired NYPD officer. It was a woman in a gray suit. She didn't introduce herself. She placed a file on the table. "You're free to go," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of warmth or judgment. I looked at her. My neck was stiff, the muscles corded and tight. "The investigation, pending," she said. She pushed the file toward me. "Your lawyer is outside. He's from the firm representing the board of directors." I didn't touch the file. The paper looked too white under the harsh light. "The board?" I asked. My voice sounded rusty. "They're framing it as a rogue executive action," she said, reciting a prepared script. "Protocol Omega was unauthorized. You are a whistleblower. The CEO has been placed on leave." There was clean. Too clean. I stood up. My legs felt heavy, like I was wading through wet concrete. I walked out of the room, through the bustling precinct, and into the cool night air of the street. My lawyer, a man I had never hired, who was waiting by a black sedan. He held the door open. I walked past him. I didn't get in. I just started walking. I walked for blocks. The city was loud, alive, indifferent. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows that stretched and snapped as I passed. I felt the vibration of the subway rumbling beneath the pavement, a deep, earth-shaking shudder that traveled up through the soles of my shoes. My phone buzzed in my pocket. There, twice. Then, silence. I didn't check it. I knew what it was. The notifications from the compliance cloud sync. The legal alerts. The termination notice. The lawsuit for breach of NDA. I stopped at a crosswalk. The red hand blinked. "Don't walk." I looked up at the skyscraper I had just left. It loomed against the night sky, a monolith of glass and steel. The lights were still on in the executive level. I could see the faint blue glow of the emergency strobes. Still pulsing. The evidence was out. The truth was logged. But the building still stood. The structure was intact. I put my hand in my breast pocket. The printout was gone. The police had taken it as evidence. But the memory of the sharp edge against my thumb lingered. A fantôme sensation. A car pulled up to the curb. Not a police cruiser. Not a black sedan. Just a taxi. The window rolled down. "You need a ride?" the driver asked. I looked at him. Then I looked back at the tower. I had won the battle. I had exposed the rot. But I had lost the war of attrition. I would spend the next 10 years in depositions, bankrupt and unhirable. The company would rebrand. The CEO would settle. The extraction squad would get new contracts. "No," I said. I turned away from the curb. I walked into the dark of the park. The air was cold, biting at my exposed skin. You invited me here as a joke? I whispered to the empty path. The wind rustled the dry leaves, a friction sound like thousands of tiny feet scuttling away. Maybe you should have. I kept walking. The path ahead was unlit. I couldn't see where it ended. I could only feel the cold pavement under my feet, solid and unforgiving. Loop L6 was closed. The story was over. But the silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. The room wasn't an interrogation cell. It was worse. It was conference room B on the 4th floor, the human resources neutral zone. The air conditioning was set to a frigid temperature that made the condensation on the pitcher of water in the center of the table weep steady, silent tears onto the polished wood. He sat alone on one side. Across from me sat a phalanx of 3. The VP of HR, the general counsel, and an external audit lead who smelled faintly of antiseptic hand sanitizer. They didn't look at me with anger. They looked at me with the weary disappointment of parents whose child had broken an expensive vase. We've reviewed the upload logs, the audit lead said. He tapped a stack of paper. My life, reduced to 12-point font on recycled stock. The sound was a dry thwack in the quiet room. Technically, the data integrity is compromised. You bypassed the chain of custody. I saved the data, I said. My voice was a croak. My throat felt lined with sandpaper. Meridian was melting the physical drives. Allegedly, the general counsel corrected smoothly. He didn't look up from his tablet. The blue light from the screen reflected in his rimless glasses, turning his eyes into blank, glowing discs. There is no physical evidence of Meridian personnel on the premises. The security logs for the 26th floor were corrupted during the power outage you initiated. I stared at him. The weight in my chest grew heavier, a physical pressure like a lead apron used for X-rays. They were doing it. They were rewriting reality in real time. The board has accepted the CEO's resignation due to health reasons. The VP of HR said softly. Her voice was practiced, soothing, lethal. We are launching a full internal inquiry into the procedural irregularities discovered in the archives. Irregularities? I laughed. A short, sharp bark that sounded too loud. It was laundering. Cartel money. Irregularities? She repeated, her tone hardening just enough to cut skin. Which brings us to your position. She slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It wasn't a termination notice. It was a non-disclosure agreement. Thick, creamy paper. Expensive. We are prepared to offer a separation package, she said. Full pension vesting. 6-month severance. Neutral reference. And if I don't sign, then we will be forced to pursue litigation for the destruction of company property. Specifically, the server room door, the crash cart, and the unauthorized modification of network infrastructure. The general counsel said, we will also file criminal charges for hacking under the CFAA. You'll be unhireable. You'll be bankrupt before the first deposition. The silence in the room was absolute. The only sound was the hum of the HVAC vent above my head. A low, indifferent drone. I looked at the pen she had placed on top of the paper. It was a black Mont Blanc. Heavy. Cold. This was the cost. I hadn't saved the company. I had just inconvenienced it. The organism was healing itself, closing the wound, and expelling the foreign body. Me? I reached for the pen. My hand trembled. A fine, neurological vibration I couldn't control. You invited me here as a joke? I whispered, remembering the words I had thought in the elevator. The feeling of being a punchline in a joke I didn't understand. The VP of HR blinked. She didn't understand the context. She thought I was talking about the meeting, about my career. She looked at the general counsel, then back to me. She leaned forward slightly, her expression shifting from professional detachment to a momentary, unguarded pity. A long silence stretched between us, filled only by the tick, tick, tick of the wall clock. Maybe you should have, she said quietly. She didn't mean I should have been a joke. She meant I should have treated it like one. I should have played the game. I should have looked away. I uncapped the pen. The click was loud, like a bone snapping. I signed. The ink was black and wet. It dried instantly in the cold, dry air. I stood up. I didn't take the copy. I didn't shake their hands. I walked to the door. My legs felt hollow. Leave your badge at the front desk, the audit lead said, already organizing his papers. I walked out of the room, leaving the cold, the silence, and my career behind on the table. It was 11:00 a.m. on a Tuesday. The light coming through the blinds of my apartment was aggressive, a stark, white daylight that revealed every dust mote dancing in the stagnant air. I should have been in the server room. I should have been monitoring the traffic spikes from the Asia-Pacific nodes. I should have been answering emails. Instead, I was standing in my kitchen, wearing sweatpants, watching a single fly bump repeatedly against the window pane. A soft thump. Buds. Another thump. The silence of a residential building during working hours was a specific kind of heavy. It was the sound of being left behind. The rest of the world was turning, producing, commuting. I was static. I looked at the kitchen island. The copy of the NDA lay there, next to my keys and a half-empty mug of cold coffee. The paper was thick, creamy, and expensive. It was the tombstone of my career. I picked up my phone. It was a new burner, prepaid. My old number had been remotely disconnected before I even left the HR conference room yesterday. I opened the banking app. The notification was there, sitting at the top of the feed like a digital scar. Wire transfer received. $450,000. Cinna, Meridian Holdings LLC. Severance. Hush money. The price of a soul in the current market exchange. I switched to the newsfeed. I scrolled past the sports scores and the weather warnings until I found it. It wasn't a headline. It was a sidebar item on the business page, buried below the fold. Tech giant CEO steps down amid health concerns. Board cites executive burnout and technical infrastructure overhaul. Stock rally expected. And there was no mention of the compliance cloud upload. No mention of the cartel. No mention of a rogue IT manager holding a dot matrix printout in a riser shaft. The legal hold worked. Not the way the law intended, but the way the company designed it. They had contained the blast. They had scrubbed the archives. They had paid off the witnesses. The upload I made was safe in the federal bunker in Nevada. Yes. But it was just data. Without context, without a prosecutor willing to dig through the petabytes of daily compliance logs, it was just noise. I had polluted their database, but they had simply built a new wall around the pollution and called it infrastructure overhaul. My chest felt hollow, a physical cavity where my indignation used to be. The lactic acid from the stairwell climb was gone, replaced by a deep, marrow-level exhaustion. I wasn't a hero. I was a transaction expense. I put the phone down. I needed to eat. Not because I was hungry, but because it was something to do. Something to break the paralysis. I opened the freezer. I took out a frozen meal, something processed, wrapped in plastic, devoid of color. I turned to the microwave. It was a standard consumer model, stainless steel, digital display, a clock that was always blinking 12 o'clock because I never bothered to set it. I placed the frozen tray inside. I closed the door. Click. My hand hovered over the keypad. I remembered the smell of the burning laptop, the ozone, the sparks popping like fireworks, the feeling of absolute clarity when I watched the evidence melt. That was the only moment in the last 48 hours where I had felt real agency, where I had controlled the timeline. Now, the timeline controlled me. I pressed 2 minutes. I pressed start. A low, steady hum filled the kitchen. The machine came to life. The tray began to rotate. The light inside turned on, a sickly yellow glow that illuminated the plastic-wrapped food spinning in circles. I watched it, round and round, going nowhere, heating up, but never changing state. I realized then that the microwave protocol wasn't about destroying evidence. It was about what happens to the things that survive the heat. They don't come out clean. They come out warped, rubberized, changed. The company would survive. The data would sit in the dark. And I would sit here, watching the timer count down the minutes of a life that no longer had a login credential. 03, 02, 01. A sharp electronic kime. Babe. Biep. The sound was sharp, final, and meaningless. I didn't open the door. I just stood there in the cold daylight, listening to the fan spin down into silence.